Good morning, everyone. This is Nana Leo, President of AFCEA Bethesda. Thank you for attending AFCEA Bethesda's March Breakfast webinar. We really appreciate everyone's flexibility in moving this breakfast to a virtual format. And we have an excellent panel discussion lined up for you this morning on the topic of leveraging data strategy for AI ML. Before we get started with today's session, I wanted to share with you some information on our upcoming events in light of the current situation. Like everyone else, AFCEA Bethesda is closely monitoring the developments regarding the coronavirus and making changes to our planned events as needed. Please continue to check our chapter website and the event websites for updates to our future events. Our next two breakfasts in April and May are currently scheduled to be at the National Press Club, but we will update you as needed to respond to the current situation. These events may either be postponed or changed to a virtual format. We will keep you apprised through emails, social media, and the event website as well. We're also planning a LEAPS Technology Forum, currently scheduled for May 19th and 20th, and also at the National Press Club. This program brings together law enforcement and public safety officials and their industry counterparts to discuss best practices in transformation and innovation. If we make any changes to this event as well, we will share these updates via email, social media, and the event website. Once again, thank you for joining us and being flexible. And we really are excited since we have over 300 people registered for this particular webinar. As you know, it is a live webinar, and we will introduce our panel in a few minutes. In a few minutes. Now, I would like to introduce Greg Mundell, Account Executive at Science Logic and Vice President for the Automation Chapter of the AFCEA Bethesda Breakfast Series, who will introduce our program today. Greg, on to you.
Thanks, Nana. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. We're really excited to conclude this series of 3 breakfast events on automation with today's panel, which is on leveraging a data strategy for AI ML. We're bringing together chief data officers and automation experts this morning. We'll continue to look at the technology, the policy, and the workforce strategies that agencies are using to transform IT services and operations, as well as advance agency missions. Before we begin, I wanted to thank the Breakfast Committee for putting this event together. This event could not have been possible without your support. I'd also like to thank our sponsors who are listed on the screen. Without our sponsors, we could not produce this year-long program that covers issues within our industry. Also, and probably more importantly, their contributions support the AFCEA Bethesda Scholarship Program, which enables students to attend college in various STEM programs and expand IT programs in public schools. Today's panel will discuss how federal agencies can harness the power of automation and AI ML to position data as a strategic asset that can be used to increase the effectiveness of government. Our discussion this morning will begin with keynote remarks by Dr. Dimitri Kusnezov, Deputy Undersecretary for Artificial Intelligence and Technology at the Department of Energy. His remarks will be followed by a moderated panel discussion. One thing I wanted to bring up to note is that if you look at the bottom of your screen, you will see a Q&A feature. Please submit your questions as the session progresses, and we'll get to the questions during the panel session. Also, if you experience any technical issues, please use the Q&A feature as well to alert us. Now, I will turn it over to Dr. Kusnezov for his remarks.
Morning. It's nice to be here, and thank you to AFCEA for hosting this. This is new to me. I haven't been teleworking in ever until now, and so this is certainly a novel experience. And so trying to work our way through it just like everybody else in the audience. You know, the challenges here are timely, important, and I think on everybody's minds. You know, how do we think about data today? What is it we can do with it? What is its purpose? What are the challenges we face? And, you know, DOE at its core, the Department of Energy, lives in the space of having to make decisions for rare events. You know, whether it is the energy sector, we have to make sure we keep the lights on. Right now, we're purchasing or planning to purchase 77 million barrels of oil to put in the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to keep oil and gas flowing while the prices are cheap. We secure infrastructure and networks and nuclear facilities and nuclear security. There are a lot of places where we are making high-risk decisions, increasingly informed not just by simulation, which are kind of the historic roots, but by data. And learning how to make decisions from data is something I think on everybody's mind right now. You know, when you think about coronavirus, when you think about the data you are getting, how you are trying to assess risk, you know, this is a fairly close analog. You're getting data. You don't know how complete it is. You're having to make decisions. The decisions matter. You try and gather it, and effectively you are the AI, or probably just the I, that tries to balance decisions in the best way according to the outcomes that you are trying to achieve. And it's similar to what we've been challenged with for many years in terms of things that are important to you and the nation, in terms of our overall security and energy. And so data today is at the core of that. You know, so what is data? We use it loosely. Data for the purpose of learning. This is the third of the breakfasts that kind of wraps up the data and the machine learning pieces that have been discussed. And it's that intersection that is pretty non-trivial. You know, what is the data? Who has it? Can you touch it? Is it actually useful for applying machine learning? You know, there are many tough questions that each of us are struggling with. Where do you host it? You know, my experience in looking for data is a lot of people feel that they have data, but as you try and track it down and understand whether it's good for anything, it is a long road. There isn't a lot of data that is ready to go for things, and sensitivity to the data practices, and structuring it with purpose makes a lot of difference. You know, data that matters, really more importantly, good data. And I think that is not a well-defined concept because it depends on the kinds of questions you are asking. You know, so first, should you care? You know, questions you could ask yourself: are there places where you are trying to make important decisions without full awareness of all the information? You know, obviously with coronavirus in our day-to-day lives, yes. In our missions, similarly, increasingly as we instrument, as we measure, as we gather data from so many different places, we have the sense that there is a lot more opportunity out there if we could simply see with more clarity through the complexities of the data. So if there are places where you feel that's the case, then you should be caring. Do you accept risk in your missions, in your jobs, in ways you can't quite define, where manpower limits, is the rate limiting factor for what you can do, whether it's in cybersecurity, whether it's in health, whatever the sector. Are you managing risk in somehow integrating your best expert advice with limited access to data and tools to manage things? I think a lot of people are in that place, including us. And I think the challenge is the data situation is simply growing. It's growing sometimes exponentially fast as smarter storage, better ways to aggregate and accrue data are becoming commercially available. It's simply a future for us with smart devices and smart systems that will be measuring a lot more. And so even if we can balance it today, that's not a stationary point. It's going to change, and before you know it, there'll be too much data. If any of those are things that resonate with you, then you really need to think about data in the context of AI and machine learning. When you think about data, you shouldn't think about it just by itself as an asset or as a single thing, because by itself, at least from my point of view, applying learning to data as an add-on, as in the model of, well, we're just going to gather a lot of data, then we'll figure out what the machine learning people can figure out about that. That's not a good strategy. The places where we've had the most success, the places where we have built something, are places where we've defined machine learning workflows. And what I mean by that are teams of people that cover a breadth of different skills. Some are focused on the data. Some are the subject matter experts for the data that live there. Some are the ones that put it in the format that is useful. Some apply the learning. Some fill in the gaps, and some ask whether you need additional data, whether you should do some experiments, whether you should simulate things, and you create a cycle so the data can be ingested. It can be labeled appropriately, structured appropriately, but fluidly developed into a workflow so that you're just pouring it in. And so you should think about data in the context of the use model, a business model in which outcomes are coming out of one side and data is pouring into the other, rather than here is the data and I'm just going to append to it a machine learning add-on. And I think that is a far less optimal way of doing things. So thinking about an overall workflow for learning that includes data and your data strategy, where the workflow is focused on the business outcome you want, I think are the important ways to think of this. So don't just say we're going to have a data strategy, put it in the context of how it'll be used and the teams that will be built around it. Unlike analytics, where you ask a question in the form of instructions and it looks through the data, it searches for this or that, and that's what you get out. Learning methods surface whatever. They will surface the wrong results. They will surface the obvious results. And it'll take time to figure out what are the right ones that come out. Eventually, when you find some novel things, you'll have to pour through that, and it'll take some expertise. Using learning on data is not a panacea or a plug and play. And the learning results could vary from day to day. You might get into a situation where you've learned something from the data today, and as you fluidly inject data and update, the answer tomorrow is opposite. And you might think, well, what's wrong? Well, unlike analytics, what you extract from the data can change. It can change dramatically as you augment the information, as it tips from kind of one understanding to the next. We are seeing that as we work day to day through coronavirus as we kind of balance our own risk, and as we are kind of the processing unit for this kind of AI, our personal views are likely changing as we aggregate data from our own experiences, from going to the grocery store, from the news, from family, from other sources. And so you will have to expect learning to change. And that's why, data strategies have to include methods to define what data you used and what tools you use to get what kind of outcomes. As you continually aggregate data, how do you document, for example, a snapshot in time of this is the data set that led to these recommendations with this set of tools that were written with these algorithms, and if you are relying more and more on this, a way to archive the data you use so that you could go back and say, well, last year we had this decision, how come? Are you able to pull out the data, pull out the old tools and compare what has changed? So these are things that we have certainly honed over the years for software tools, where we can actually go back to a timestamp of 3 years ago. This is what the predictions told us, and this is why. We're going to need those kinds of things also in the data world, and data strategies tied to algorithms used and outcomes presented, I think, are going to have to be part of this. The problem with data is that we have no real understanding of how much you need. There is no theory of data, so we don't know if data is complete or correct. We don't know if the data is suitable to answer the questions we're interested in understanding. And the data by itself can't tell us whether predictions from the data are actionable. Let's say you've applied this within your agency or your business and you've learned something. Would you bet the farm on that? It is kind of still some uncharted territory on how you make sure that that results coming from learning applied to the data you're aggregating can somehow bound the range of actions which are sensible. Today, it is a mixture of experts with the analysis that have to go together, and you can't simply rely on the data itself for this. In the future, that's going to change, but we're not so far down the road. So you have to think about data in this way as you structure strategies and think about the future in learning. Understanding sensitivities and I think acting on predictions without understanding those could easily lead you down the wrong path. And so I think care has to be taken in all of this. So, what should you be thinking about? And again, I think these kinds of webinars and fora are good because all of these problems are hard and we're all struggling with them. It'll take really a team effort to try and work our way through it. No one has the answer out there. If people say they have the answer for you, I would say don't believe them. I would say we don't even know all the questions today that we should be asking with respect to data, with respect to modeling, and with respect to making decisions. And so you have to be flexible in strategies that we should be developing because we have to get our heads around what to measure, what to archive, what its purpose is, and start this learning path so that we can get to the future we need, making better decisions from the data that we are all going to be gathering, whether we want to or not. So it has to be flexible. Data has to be viewed as dynamic. It changes in time. How do we track that? How do we understand it? It isn't simply just a thing. And it might not have the value that you think. There are places we found where the data is actually not very useful, and there are other places where it turns out to be more useful. And we've run into this in partnerships over the years as we've, partners have brought in data that they thought have been, not useful data, dark data that they've kept proprietary in their businesses. And as we found that you could unlock value and we started to gain some successes lead to failure, in the sense that people start to think, well, maybe the data is more valuable than I think, and maybe I shouldn't share it. And so there is an important social dynamic associated with data, the subtleties of data use agreements that will have to be worked through. And there aren't good answers to that, but be aware that as people find more value in data that they thought previously was not very useful, they might decide, well, we don't want to do this with you anymore. Maybe we should go alone. I think that's the wrong answer. I think there are too many hard problems out there. I think that creating workflows and archiving data in the right way and models is going to be something where best practices and lessons learned have to be shared. I think it's a necessary journey we're all on. This is our future. It'll require us working together, and most of this future is uncharted. So, that was my main points here. I think we have really an excellent panel that have been put together of colleagues here who will also share very similar stories. And I'm certainly honored to be on the panel with them as well today. And I hope everyone is staying safe. So back to you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Kusnezov, for your opening remarks. Now we'd like to turn it over to our panel for further discussion. Our moderator this morning is Jason Miller, Executive Editor at Federal News Network. Our panelists today are Dr. Gil Alterovitz, Director of the National Artificial Intelligence Institute at the VA, Stephen Babitch, Head of Artificial Intelligence Portfolio, TTS at GSA, Ted Kaouk, Chief Data Officer at the USDA, and again, Dr. Dimitri Kusnezov, Deputy Undersecretary at the Department of Energy. As a reminder to our audience, again, to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions. Jason, I turn it over to you now. Thank you.
Thanks, Greg. Thanks, Nana, for inviting me to do this. As you heard, I'm Jason Miller, Federal News Network Executive Editor. It's federalnewsnetwork.com, 1500 AM. It's my usual spiel. Let me just start by saying, first of all, I really appreciate you guys doing this. I think moving to a virtual is really helpful for the community. There's only so much coronavirus news we all can take at any one time, so it's really great to talk about other things. That being said, I do encourage everyone to continue to visit our site, to visit my news colleagues' site across the market, continue to listen, continue to watch. There's a lot of great news organizations out there, and I'll just be honest, we really don't want us or anyone else to go away. There was actually some furloughs already in the market. Some of our news brethren are being furloughed, and I just wish those journalists well, and I hope that's a short furlough. And let's be honest, there's plenty of non-coronavirus news out there. Just this week alone, I wrote about interesting things like IPv6 and of course the CMMC. So you can find all that on our site and our colleagues' site around the community. So as many as you know, I like to start with some trivia. I'm not gonna do that because it's hard to do it virtually, but I do want to make this very interactive. Please submit your questions. Please take part in this. Remember, I'm a journalist. That's my job. But I really want you guys to ask your questions that you think are most appropriate. And please let me know if they're specific to a person or just into the entire panel. I just want to start with a couple quick data points before we get started. First of all, it's been about a year since President Donald Trump signed the executive order on artificial intelligence. That launched the American AI Initiative and really did a lot more to bring AI into the discussion. OMB GSA launched an AI community of practice. I don't want to steal too much from Steve, but I'll just say that community of practice is, which kicked off in November, has more than 400 members from 26 agencies. A lot of interest in AI. On the spending side, this is obviously from the most recent budget request. Civilian agencies are expected to spend more than $1 billion on AI programs over the next year, ranging from the Agriculture Department using AI technologies for food research to energy using AI internally through Dimitri's new office, AI and Technology. And the Defense Department is going to spend more than $106 billion for research and development alone in fiscal 2021, with AI being a major focus. So I just want to add a couple pieces of context before we get started. Let's kick off. Again, like any panel I do, we're unrehearsed, unplanned, and there is no pre-planned questions. So I've asked everyone to take about 3 to 5 minutes to tell the audience something they don't know about AI and what they're doing with data. So Ted, I'll volunteer you first since you're right there in front of me. That was Gil. We can go with Ted or Gil, whoever. Gil, you want to take it?
Sure. Yeah, hello, everyone. So I'm Gil Alterovitz, Director of the National Artificial Intelligence Institute here at the VA, and we've had a number of different exciting items that have come up. We've completed the artificial intelligence tech sprint, and as a result of that, there have been a couple of organizations that are now continuing with different pilots. And so what we have seen is a really great way to interact with industry and other partners through the AI Tech Sprint, which has involved companies and other organizations working around VA and also in some cases other agency data and involving different experts working together. So the quick update, one of the quick updates there is that one of the organizations just completed a clinical trial matching program that is now been evaluated by the Office of Information Technology, looking around different metrics to make it production ready. And just a couple of weeks ago, it was evaluated as being production ready for getting access to that data. So that could empower 9+ million veterans once it is activated to search and look for clinical trials and experimental therapeutics that may be suitable for them, which is a great technology to have, and one that's especially relevant today when we're thinking about some of the potential treatments that may that are being investigated. There's a number of other areas that we're looking at. For example, one of the things that's really powerful and interesting about the VA is about how that there are many different offices that are now being brought together around AI. And so a number of offices looking and interested to come together around AI and leveraging that for the health and well-being of the veterans. So that's one of the other items that's kind of emerging recently. And then we're participating in a number of interagency and other types of meetings. There's you may have seen from the interagency on AI research and development, there was recently a data set that was released around COVID. And the VA has been one of the agencies involved in that as well. All right, thanks. So I'll pass it on to the next person.
Actually, I'm going to jump in and do my usual, my one follow-up question for you, Gil. So when you talk about some of the data sharing that you're talking about, and can you walk me through that piece that I think Dimitri hit upon well? Have you guys gone in with this idea of, okay, what's the outcome we're trying to get to, and then where does the data fit? Walk me through maybe a little bit of the process and how the data and the processes all fit together.
Right. So I think that's really one of the interesting challenges is that often data is collected, as Dimitri was mentioning, maybe for one reason, and it may have, and those, it may be used for analyzing and finding results for that particular reason, but there may be other uses for that data as well. And so when you get to kind of secondary uses, you have to examine a number of the challenges, like, can it be used for that reason? Has it been consented for use for that reason? Do you need to get consent again? There are a lot of different potential challenges. And especially when you're working with external and other organizations, how do you make that data available? And so those are some of the items that we've been exploring, for example, in the AI Tech Sprint and in other cases as well. And so for that particular sprint, what we did is we designed a use case, which was around, in that case, for the last one, clinical trial matching. We're now looking for future tech sprints at other use cases. If people have ideas, feel free to email them. I've been getting different ideas over time, and we've been looking at different ideas for the new one. But in that case, it was around clinical trial matching. And so the data sets were either developed for that particular sprint, or they leveraged other data that we worked to ensure that it had the different permissions and the different availabilities to be used, and then created data use agreements and so forth based on that. We got, part of that process was we got feedback and we learned about different processes. The other approach, of course, is to create synthetic data. For initial testing, and then you can design it specifically for your particular use case and go from there. The one last thing I'd want to add is that there's a lot also to think about data sets and how they can work together. So rather than releasing one data set, it was an ecosystem of data sets that were interrelated. So when you imagine, for example, someone searching for a trial, you've got information about the so-called patient looking for the trial, the physician, the demographics, you've got pieces of information about the trial itself, where it's located. And so having all that put together makes for an efficient use case that allows that to work together.
All right, Gil, thank you very much. That was great. The one quick follow-up I would have for you is, did you have blanket permission when you got started, or did you have to go back and ask for blanket permission, like as things moved along?
Right. So what we designed in this case was data sets that we already were already set with from the beginning, as well as developing new processes toward making additional types of data available in the future. So as part of in this case, as part of that sprint, we got feedback of what type of data sets would be useful for the future, and then. Although those data sets were not potentially made available for that sprint, they may be available for future ones as we work through those processes.
All right, very good. Thank you for that. All right, let's move on to our next panelist, Ted from USDA.
Morning, everybody. So I'd like to start by, as I think Jason mentioned, I'm the Chief Data Officer at USDA. It's interesting to be talking about this topic in the present situation. There is a good analogy, I think we heard that earlier this morning, to the appetite that everybody has for increased data. So I think the meme that's been most relevant in the last couple of weeks is flattening the curve, that sort of entered the parlance with the coronavirus as people are assessing their own risk and we're thinking collectively about how to respond. That's certainly something that we've found with leaders and employees at USDA, is that there is an intense appetite for data, but in a lot of cases, the data just was not available to them to be able to iterate and to think about how to ask better and better questions. So we've actually, in a very large agency, 8 mission areas and 19 agencies, just completed a significant series of sprints where we've launched dashboards to all of our mission areas to give them those foundational capabilities. So just an example of the kind of work that we do, the diversity of the work and the insights that are available. And then I'll talk a little about the process and how that's leading into deeper questions and more complex questions. Through our Farm Production and Conservation Service, where we provide loans to farmers and technical assistance for conservation practices, all of our state conservationists now have access to a real-time scorecard with more than a dozen metrics that allows them to more efficiently administer the programs and provide better customer support. We also manage all of our national forests at USDA, so our forest supervisors have just received access to a 360-degree view of their key metrics, whether that's timber sales or treating the forests for wildfire risk, budget, fleet, HR data. Having that 360-degree view for them to be able to better manage our natural and government resources. And one final example among many is just scientists and operational field leaders in our food safety and inspection service, where we do inspections for meat and poultry in every processing plant across the country, giving them 360-degree views into the status of laboratory sampling, excuse me, as well as public health indicators. So how did we get to that place where people have access to data, which wasn't true just even a couple of years ago, the fundamental kind of process that we followed was asking people and asking leaders across the department what questions they had. And that might be a little bit harder than it sounds, but not ultimately that difficult. We first really got them to think about what was important to them, right? So, and typically what we found initially when we asked them that question, they might think about what data they had access to, and so that may have constrained the question that they asked. So we tried to open the aperture through some divergent and convergent thinking exercises where we said, you know, if you're a beach person or a mountain person, wherever you do your thinking, getting them outside of the organizational context, what's the real question that you had? And then looking across our vast data assets at USDA to be, or outside of USDA, to be able to bring those insights together and then fitting the solution to be able to answer the question. But doing it in a really iterative way through sprints where those leaders got to react to the data they were seeing and they got to ask better and better questions. So that's been really, really instructive for us is that one, we were able to answer a lot more questions than we thought possible. And by asking those questions, we also got to better questions. We also prioritized what data was most important and what questions were most important today. And that's helped us to think much more strategically about how we're going to manage and use this data. So, and I think one of the things that we found as we did this was through a data maturity assessment, a data management maturity assessment, was that we had a lot of strengths in our data management practices, but we also had a lot of things to work on. And one of those things is having the right level of leadership. Very complex mission areas. Talked about a few of them already. One of them is rural development, which is the 5th or 6th largest lender in the country. And so each of these mission areas, we really just not yet had, I think what's happened in the last few years in the private sector, leadership, where people are actually looking at their data strategies from the perspective of the business and from the perspective of business value. So we've established assistant chief data officers in each of those mission areas over the last couple of months. We've now been working through an enterprise governance process to be able to govern the dashboard adoption strategies, to be able to integrate data into an enterprise platform and build that out. And then also to build communities of practice for advanced analytics to be able to look at these kinds of things. When it came to artificial intelligence and machine learning, you know, again, when those questions required those kinds of methodologies, we applied them. So in many cases, people didn't think we had access to data that could answer their questions. And in some cases, natural language processing was one way of getting to those insights. So looking at procurement documents to be able to train a model on getting better insights into where IT spend is happening, looking at patent and trademark data to be able to, and linking that with USDA research to be able to see what's the impact of research, because that was the question people were asking, right? So I think sort of the final point I leave with folks is, again, this appetite that we suspected was there, so we're able to confirm that for sure, and it's now leading into deeper questions and sort of this art of the possible, where people have realized we could do more than we thought, all of which were dependent upon the data management practices we had in place. But we also now know a lot more about what challenges we have and what data we might need to collect differently. And so that's going to be instructive for the future. So happy to answer any questions about that as we go forward.
All right, you know, Ted, I have a question for you. Not
Great.
Just the one thing that comes to mind as you roll out these dashboards, and this is something you guys have been working on, I think, for the past year and a half, and correct me if I'm wrong. Do people understand how to use the dashboards? It's one thing to see the data and go, okay, that red looks good, or that green looks good, or those numbers, that bar chart looks good. But how are you helping them use that data to make good decisions?
Sure, and that's a really critical part, I think, of all of this is the training, right? So one I would say is when you look at how we're consuming data today, it is changing, and I do think people are, in a widespread way, looking at data and looking at data visualizations more than they have in the past. That being said, when we started about 18 months ago, there were questions about the value of data visualization, right? So we actually did a full educational campaign on what kinds of insights are available to people, right? What time it could save them in terms of pulling manual reports together for things that were more descriptive, best practices for communicating data visually. We did an internal data visualization competition to train employees on how to use those best practices. So certainly education has been really important, and we've done much more granular trainings on the individual dashboards so we can train the users of all those dashboards, and they were designed for specific user sets to help them understand how to use them, and also to how to give feedback on it, right? So now as we're kind of launching into phase 2, those best practices that kind of have organically grown up across the department have been turned into a list of best practices on how to communicate and how to drive adoption, but how to educate people as to how to use them.
All right, excellent, very good, appreciate it. Let's move to Steve Babitch from GSA. Steve?
Thanks, Jason, and good morning, everyone. From a GSA perspective, you had mentioned this, Jason, a little bit in your intro, but following the AI executive order last year, the GSA has now stood up a focus on AI through the U.S. Technology Transformation Service. So I lead the AI portfolio within TTS. And we've got a couple of things we're trying to do there. We've got our AI Center of Excellence, where we are looking to, that's sort of the implementation and delivery mechanism. So we work directly with agencies such as JAIC, HUD, USDA, and others on how to implement and lay the foundation for the use and application of AI. And then on the non-implementation side, we've got the portfolio where we're standing up a community of practice. We had our kickoff October 31st last year, where we are very keen and interested in sharing the different use cases, the lessons learned, and the best practices that are out there across the federal government landscape. And how do we pull that in and aggregate that and then share that and disseminate it back out to agencies? So I definitely welcome almost a call to action. Maybe I'll repeat this again at the end, but if you have use cases that you are willing to share within the government, we absolutely want to talk with you. So I'm looking at you, Ted, Dimitri, Gil, et cetera, but would love to talk with you more going forward. And so, again, there's the implementation side. There's also that community of practice side, and how do we start to build that repository of use cases? How do we provide guidance in the form of an executive guide to AI? This is something that we're looking to build as well. Then on the implementation side, as far as JAIC and the HUD, for example, we're starting to lay the foundation there with some early data governance and the strategy around how we manage the data. So at a high level, that's sort of the focus of what we're doing in TTS broadly.
All right, excellent. We'll get to everyone's questions in a second. One quick follow-up for Steve.
Sure.
Let's focus maybe on the implementation side for a second. The work you're doing with HUD and the Joint AI Center at DoD. Is data governance usually that first step towards making this more implementable, useful, whatever word you want to say? Because a lot of people will talk governance and go, oh no, another governance exercise, right?
Right, exactly. Great question. And I think what we're seeing is it's almost case by case how this is happening in different agencies. Certainly, you've got pockets of work happening where there might be piloting a use of AI in a particular business area or application. And so you've got some of that bottom-up activity happening. And then at the same time, you're trying to think about how do we marry up what's happening at the ground level with that more senior leadership buy-in. And that does then drive a conversation around, okay, if this activity is happening, we got to sort of get ahead of it as well to make sure we're doing things in the right way and we're being cognizant of issues around privacy, around security, around ethics. And so now that we have CDOs established across the federal government, they and other senior leaders have to sort of establish that governance structure. So it does feel like a bit of marrying from both sides, and both are equally important. And you really do have to have both to sort of drive a broader effort enterprise-wide.
All right, let me bring Dimitri back into the conversation as well. Dimitri, your keynote was interesting in several different. I got a nice couple tweets out there on it. I wanted to touch upon the one thing that I thought was very interesting that maybe could help out is the strategy side of it. You talked about just don't come up with data, start doing processing it, and then go, okay, now let's add ML AI to it. Walk me through maybe just a little bit more about how do you fit in the workflows this idea of ML AI from the beginning, or at least close to the beginning.
Yeah, I was also going to ask Stephen a question.
Please do. Make it
Put me on the spot.
Get going.
So if I could get back to yours, Jason, in just a second, Stephen, what struck me is you have kind of a unique view across all the federal agencies of who's doing what. And you have a sense of, where gaps are emerging, workforce needs and best in class. And, how does the landscape look to you, and kind of what's a role you might have in capturing best in class to redisseminate across federal agencies in some ongoing way, so that we can better know how to move forward consistent with the executive order and so on.
Sure. No, absolutely. And I think that's the challenge, is the US government's not exactly a small place to go and investigate and try to survey what's happening. So we are literally in the midst of trying to connect with and engage the various leaders across agencies, the people who are doing it at the practitioner level. And so I sort of alluded to it earlier, but again, there's a lot of activity happening. But it's still the early days, and people are experimenting, as you rightly pointed out as well. So how do we want to, our aim, and that's sort of what the White House, the Office of Science and Tech Policy, Office of American Innovation, GSA, they want us to be that focal point to aggregate and pull that together. So the conversations that we're having are exactly the kind of opportunity we have to connect with folks like you. So the more that we can pull in those kinds of use cases and those applications, whether that's actually at a sort of specific use case of AI, or if that's actually a more a higher level strategic initiative in terms of laying that foundational data strategy in place, we do want to be that connective tissue to pull it in. So I would want to absolutely follow up with you to speak more, because we haven't done that yet. But if we do that, I think what we're hearing from different federal agencies is, look, I think I have an application or a problem that I want to solve, and I think AI might benefit, AI could be beneficial. Who else is doing that? And there are certainly, if it's HR or finance, or there's sort of cross-agency, there are opportunities to do that. And then there's also sort of mission-specific applications as well. But I don't know if that's quite answering your question, but we're again in the early days of that, but that's what we want to do.
Okay, no, thanks. So back to your question, Jason.
Sorry, I was going to say, don't forget.
No. Look, I could talk about workflows and things all day, but let me see if I can just capture some salient points. The thing is, everyone is starting with some initial set of data. We all have data somewhere, and it's not the right data because we didn't gather it with the purposes we have in mind for the future. And I think Gil went through that well. And so we have a starting point, but it's certainly not necessarily the right data. And in a few years' time, the data that we actually need, depending on how our problems evolve, will change. And so what is the system in which this will all live? I think of a workflow as kind of the business model centered on the outcomes. What are you trying to achieve? And how do you make the data a piece of some cycle of development, of injecting data, of learning from it, from bringing in the experts, from filling in the gaps with modeling, and kind of continuing to evolve this as a system. And so it's not about, here's our data archive, go do something, because that's it's a very suboptimal way. The interaction of the modeling people, the algorithms people, the experts, those who own the risk in the problems you're trying to address with the data and with everyone else is kind of a shared fate model. If you have people who own data and they sit somewhere, and then you have other people who are trying to use it, there isn't a shared fate in that. And you can drive outcomes more strongly if everyone is sitting together in a cycle of development that includes data as a piece of it. But you all understand what you're trying to do, and everyone is helping with getting to that outcome, whether it is understanding a set of decisions, guaranteeing actionability, or whatever it might be. You have to think about the business model, the cycle, the workflow of the handoffs of the different skills, so that something is coming back to the data people, at the back end, and it refreshes in the right way and feeds back in a way that is, interacting continuously. And so you need that kind of system.
All right. I'm going to open it up to the panel real quick if anyone else wants to jump in. Otherwise, we have about 15 questions and a couple good ones for Ted. So Ted, get ready. You may be first on, but anyone else from the panel want to jump in on what Dimitri was just kind of addressing? Right, Steve? Nope, Steve unmuted himself. All right, so let's go to questions then. And please, attendees, please continue to send in your questions. We got a couple, one from both Brian and Andrew asked the same question for Ted. So we'll start there, Ted. Describe phase 2 of the dashboard project. Can you tell us a little bit more?
Sure. So I think that goes back to your question, actually, Jason, and some of the comments about governance. For us, it's been really valuable to have something tangible to govern, right? That there's been a recognition from leaders across our department that there's a lot of value in our data. They've seen it in a really tangible way, and now there is business pressure in the system to the expectations have been raised, right? And so because of that, I think for us, data governance is a natural next step for us to be able to remediate some of the issues that we found and to continue to drive that forward. When we think about the unique power of government data, and we think about the artificial intelligence legislation and executive order, I think that is going to be most realized when the organizations themselves understand culturally the value of sharing models and have seen that for themselves, right? So, whether that's how we collect information from the public, how we're using it internally for decision making, and then finally how we make it available for the public and private sector, at least at our department, starting internally, sharing data based on questions that leaders and employees have that are going to drive business outcomes has, I think, started that cultural journey. So whether it was a model that was developed for research purposes on wildfire risk that was then taken for the first time and used for operational treatments in the forest, that I think that kind of conversation is now, I think, making more and more people aware of when we say artificial intelligence and the value of government data and governance, why we're talking about that. So we're now talking about governance. We're talking about data stewardship. But I think as we go forward, we need to be really careful to ensure that whatever we do with data stewardship is strategic and that it has value and that people see the value. So one thing that we're looking at is that we're implementing is a data stewardship framework, right? Which is going to be both how we manage data internally for our own use cases, but how we also answer the call for how the public will use that data. And one of the things we're trying to be really careful about is showing when we implement data dictionaries and guidance on data, how that enables us to integrate data across the department for the first time in a way that we ran into trouble when we went and did the dashboards the first time. So I think it's just taking it to that next level. Again, I talked about the leadership that we put in place. Those leaders in each mission area are also standing up centralized analytics teams. And we're working as a community across the department to be able to leverage all of our best practices. Quite a number of activities. Other things I think that I mentioned quickly are things like having a data catalog. We've got a vast amount of data, but it's not really well recognized, and even in terms of our models, but also just the data itself. What data do we have available that could answer questions, so that we're not purchasing it twice, we're not creating it twice, and we're also improving where we also make people more aware of what are the secondary uses we might not have thought of. So those are some examples.
All right, excellent. Thank you for doing that. I don't know if Steve or Gil, you guys want to jump in, or Dimitri, want to jump in on the governance issue as well, since this is something that obviously cuts across everybody. I know, Steve, you've maybe adjusted a little bit, but Gil, do you want to jump in on the governance?
Well, I don't have anything.
Then no.
Ted,
okay.
yeah, okay. I think that was a really great summary that Ted did.
All right. Very nice. Let's go to another question then on the big board. we'll go to the top where people start off. Someone wrote, how are agencies considering a custom data platform, a CDP, for AI purposes? I'll just open that up to everyone on the panel. Custom data platform. All right. You may have stumped the panelists, whoever wrote that question. All right, we'll put that on the back.
Well, so look, I would say,
Dimitri.
I don't see a one size fits all. I think a lot of this is going to be tailored to the problems you're trying to solve. Again, we have mixes of data that is streaming data, it's image data, it's network data. You know, it's collections of modalities of just about anything you can imagine, and there isn't a unique way to structure that. Maybe abstractly as having a platform, but the details become specific to the use you are trying to set up and kind of the outcomes you're trying to achieve. And so you do need some kind of platform. It is custom is probably the right word. I don't know if there is an architecture for that specifically, other than everyone is probably going to have to architect the things that are optimal to their outcomes. Because in AI, there isn't a one-size-fits-all technology. There isn't a one-size-fits-all set of tools or algorithms. And there certainly isn't a one-size-fits-all data platform. And I think flexibility and customization will probably emerge as everyone struggles through this.
All right, I'm going to put a finer point on the question, since I think when I look back at it, I may have read it wrong. They asked a customer, my fault on that, a customer data platform, which makes more sense now, Dimitri. So thank you for your thoughtful answer. But a customer data platform, does that make it easier on Ted or anyone?
Sure. I mean, maybe I was thinking about the original question, and maybe I can dovetail a little bit into the updated question. I mean, we have made some efforts, and that was a really key part of what we've been implementing was standing up an enterprise analytics platform, you know, to enable a one-source access to disparate data without taking 5 years or 10 years to update our underlying data architecture, right? So and when we started, we were dealing with primarily structured data, but we wanted to build a platform that if we caught the bug, as we suspected we might, we would be able to do all sorts of analysis with different types of data. So we have stood up an enterprise platform for sharing data, for automating the data sources, for visualizing the dashboards and performing the underlying analytics work. We do want to take a much more holistic and strategic approach to the tools we're adding, to standardization for the department, so we have a more efficient way of performing analytics across the department. And the dashboards we created were internal use only originally, and so we do have a need for a public data platform, and so that's something we're going to be implementing this year, the first phase of that. So we're working kind of holistically now as we modernize, to make sure that when we modernize in the future, that we're thinking about the enterprise, because again, there are all kinds of unanticipated uses for our data, and we want to make sure that we can share it and in as easy a fashion as possible where it makes sense, but also to protect it and to ensure that we secure our data as well. So a lot more to come on that, I think.
You know, actually, just to chime in, this is actually a little bit maybe more of a follow-on from what Dimitri was describing. You know, I guess what we're seeing, you know, in some of the Center of Excellence work is, again, it's less about the data, as you're rightly pointing out, Dimitri, but it's about the problems you're trying to solve and what are those use cases. And I think in that initial effort in building that foundational data strategy, a thing that we're employing is use of human-centered design and looking to engage the range of stakeholders that really need to come to the table that might not normally do so. And so you need the technical folks, you need the acquisition folks, you need certainly the data stewards and the leadership to sort of gather and align themselves on what we are trying to achieve. How is the data going to be used, and at least begin that dialogue so people can get comfortable, because it's understandable that particularly the data stewards, they own that data and they want to make sure that it's being used in the most effective way, and we mitigate any potential pitfalls or challenges, again, around privacy and security and ethics, those kinds of issues. So I think the use of those, and that's not a sort of one and done, that is an ongoing conversation that needs to happen. And I guess to the point of the original framing of the question, custom, it's case by case in terms of who's the coalition of the willing and how do we just sort of get ourselves aligned. So.
All right, well, well done answering my my question that was not really the question, but nice job, everyone. We've got another question from Lorenzo. He asks, aside from the general access to data, how much does a lack of ability to leverage unstructured data affect mission's effectiveness? So unstructured data is the question here.
Yeah, I might add a little bit to that. So I think when you look at unstructured data, there have been a number of studies that, at least in healthcare, looking at the medical record and so forth, when you look at only structured data, or if you look at only unstructured data individually, you don't get as good of a predictive capability, whether it be for diagnostics, prognostics, and so forth, as by combining them. So there is sometimes a correlation of kind of information that is encoded in both, but there is unique information to each one. So I found that you know, in talking to a number of different use cases, that you know, we see that there's a lot of different times when integrating both unstructured and structured is useful. So just wanted to add that little tidbit there.
All right, anybody else want to jump in on the unstructured question? Dr. Dimitri or Ted or Steve?
There are a lot of places where we have tremendous amount of unstructured data, and I think we don't exactly know best way to work through that. So, you know, one example, one of our sites out west, again, we kind of date back to the Manhattan Project and a lot of Cold War legacy sites. One of our sites has 100,000 cubic feet of paper documents, and, you know, trying to get through what is in there, a lot of the safety, the health records, the site information on its state, something where the historical record will help us with the kind of a deep longitudinal understanding of how we do remediation over the decades to come, because these sites will take work for years. And so there is a large archive of unstructured data that will take a tremendous amount of time to go through to figure that out. So I think there isn't an answer yet, other than there are places where we struggle with data. We don't know exactly how to best capture and structure and put into use to help us understand future risks and directions. So it's an important question. I don't have an answer other than, yeah, I understand we should be thinking about this.
Time for a couple of thoughts on that, Jason?
Yeah, of course. Jump in, Ted.
Sure. So just from my perch, I think it's there just are vast untapped opportunities in the government to be able to use unstructured data. My hope is that, you know, in future years, that the kinds of questions that people ask will be less limited by what data they think is available. I think I mentioned that earlier. So when we got questions about how could we analyze comments that the public makes on rules and regs, you know, that's a natural opportunity to be able to leverage that kind of analysis. But when someone says, you know, we'd like to get better insights into what IT procurements are happening so we better understand our spend, and we're not sure that we have the data, well, they didn't know that we were going to go and look at procurement documents when they asked that question. But certainly that's some of the insights that we were able to kind of go after. And so, again, my hope is that as we kind of go forward, more and more people will be informed by asking questions based on what they'd like to, the insights they'd like, and then let's disprove that. Let's sort of prove that we don't have the data, right? Let's explore all the opportunities. And I think the analysis of unstructured data is still sort of in its infancy when it comes to, in government, people realizing that they could ask questions that might be answerable without having to collect new data in some cases, right? But all the things people have said about combining the data, structured, unstructured, I agree with that as well. So.
All right. Thanks. Excuse me. Thanks, Ted, for weighing in. Let's go to another one. This one is specifically for Dr. Dimitri. The writer, who's anonymous, says, great work at Energy, especially in short-term energy outlook data browser tool. The department has put out for analysis of many key indicators and associated forecasts. What type of challenges do you see in transformation areas, i.e. use cases you're tackling, through data that you handle there for those dashboards applying ML techniques? Hopefully that makes sense to you.
Yeah, so what we've created over the last half year is a dashboard, and I don't know, it sounds similar to what Ted was talking about. You know, it is, and I'm sure what other agencies are doing, but we have at least a way to understand what is going on in terms of AI, ML, and data-related projects across the department and our 17 national laboratories. Right now, we track over 600 different projects. And I think part of the challenge, first, what are we doing and who's doing what is an important question. Everything from smart vehicles and smart cities to oil and gas exploration to scientific discovery. There's a lot of just about everything. Trying to understand what tools are being used, what data they're accessing, whether this is just data people happen to have on their local server and they're using, you know, TensorFlow or just kind of off the shelf tools, is important for us to know. And so we're trying to assess who is struggling with hard data problems, hard AI problems, who is simply doing better optimization of data that you have. And the dashboard is an attempt to try and capture that. So we do have a real-time breakdown. It's called AIX. It is used in-house for transparency across the department. So when anyone wants to know who's doing what, you can cut the data in many different ways. You can dive down and see who the principal investigators are, what they're doing, kind of an abstract of their work, and more details if you want. But at least on the surface, it gives us a sense as we tally this up, you know, how much NLP are we doing? You know, how much multimodal learning are we doing? How much sparse data are we doing? How much, you know, pick your topic, we can get a sense of our internal skill set, our proficiency. And as we move ahead, that helps us understand as we start to tackle harder problems, who do we draw from? You know, where are we good at doing things? And so without an understanding of what we can do already and what data we're using, it's kind of hard to figure out how to move forward. So, you know, our data set right now is, again, maybe 6 months old. It grows every day. It requires people to input and update, and we'll see where it goes. But I think it is a nice way to feel the pulse of the department in terms of what it's trying to do in this space.
All right. Thanks, Dr. Dimitri. Gil, this one's specifically for you. So here we go. Could you please talk a bit more about any efforts to speed up the processes leveraging ML tools, if any, for type ABC adjudications when it comes to BVA cases? BVA, they didn't spell that out. So hopefully benefit veteran, hopefully you know what that is.
Yes. And can you repeat the very end of can you say that again, actually?
Sure. Talk more about any efforts to speed up the processes leveraging ML models, if any, for type A, B, C adjudications when it comes to BVA cases.
Right. So there are a number of efforts ongoing on looking at benefits, and there's an office which has released an API that enables individuals that basically uses natural language processing to process that information, and based on the NLP can actually make it much faster to process forms in a significant manner. There are other kind of efforts that are starting in this space as well. So it's great to see AI being used in a number of different areas within the VA. Yeah.
All right. Thanks for that. Let's good question from Mark, who writes, making data sets available is often a challenge with PII, PHI, and other sensitive information. And I think this is just for anyone, but how is your organization making this data available for analysis? So sensitive personal data, how you make it available for analysis. Gil's thinking.
Oh, yeah, I was just trying to take myself off mute there. Yeah, certainly, I can take this a little bit. So how do you make data available given the privacy and other concerns, right? So there's a number of different ways, and we're looking at a number of them. So one area that is synthetic data, right? So essentially looking and at the statistics of the underlying data and creating a new data set that has the same statistics, but doesn't have, can't be re-identified because you generate at the individual level a completely different data set that just has those similar statistics. Another approach is, of course, de-identifying the data. That can be particularly tricky. We were before talking about unstructured data. It may not identify the person specifically, but let's say you have a medical note and it says the mayor of the town was seen today. Well, it didn't identify them by name, but obviously you can kind of figure that out. Or when you have combinations of pieces of information, for example, maybe it's a genetic marker along with a note about what their employment, what they're and other pieces together can allow you to identify the person. So while individual pieces may not fit together, they can. And so analyzing that and having an expert determine that it cannot be identified is another way. Finally, there's combining, and this was done in the recent sprint that I mentioned, which is like combining both the synthetic and the non-synthetic data. So for data and those elements that are rather common, that you can identify the person, that you can use kind of a common, you can use the actual data. For data that might be more identifying of the person, like laboratory or other results, you can use synthetic data. And one of the collaborating agencies there actually took that approach.
And Gil, real quick, I want to bring in Steve because I think you're maybe dealing with the same thing with DoD. But Gil, there's a question from somebody about synthetic versus non-synthetic data. Can you just quickly describe what that is?
Yes. So when we're talking about synthetic data, essentially it's data that is based on actual data. So you may have, let's say, 100 patients and you have their actual data. But you look at statistics then from each of the fields. So for example, maybe blood pressure has a range of, from a certain number to a certain other number. For diastolic blood pressure, you would see then the mean, the standard deviation. From that, you'd create a new data set that has the same mean and standard deviation, but the individual numbers are completely different from the original data set. For a non-synthetic or kind of a regular data set, you may take that actual patient's data. You may then take out identifying information like the patient IDs and things like that, and with patient consent, make that data available. Finally, you can jitter the data. And that was done with the recent work around acute kidney injury. You take the data, you then vary that information so that it's not the exact same information that you receive, but maybe 20% different, so that it makes it harder. Well, it makes it, you can show that it statistically will be not possible to identify that patient with a given confidence.
All right, thank you. Steve, jump in here a little bit as well to talk about the more sensitive data, whether again it's PII or PHI or anything else as you guys work with DoD.
Yeah, I think right now we're still in the relatively early days within the JAIC, so not sure I can get into the specifics. I think right now it's more of laying that foundation and getting stakeholders around the table to, I think it goes back to Dimitri's earlier point of like, yes, we've got the data, but let's make sure we're getting clear on the problems we're actually trying to solve, and then go figure out what kind of data that we actually need to pull in. And so that does require bringing the right data stewards and folks to the table. So that, I mean, again, that's still fairly early days with the Jake, so can't really get into much of the detail beyond that.
Okay, well, thank you. A couple questions were very similar. One came up around diversity and one came up around research bias. And while they're not the same, obviously, they have similar themes. I don't know, I'll open up to anyone, Steve, or anyone else, but how are you all ensuring that there is not a research bias as you're developing the tools, and that there's a diversity of thought, diversity of people, diversity of everything when it comes to asking the right questions, and what's the end result you're trying to get to?
Yeah, I mean, from a overarching sort of community of practice effort, this is certainly an area that we are thinking about. Our federal agency partners are asking for that. So we're looking to develop some materials around how to deal with the issues around ethics and privacy and so on and so forth. I think what I'm seeing, and I certainly would love to hear Ted, Gil, Dimitri's thoughts as well, but everyone's talking around it at sort of the principle level. So roughly there's the same 5 to 7 principles being put out there: accountability, transparency, fairness, et cetera. But how do you really take that down to the practice level? And that's what we're trying to think through. And again, take the actual federal agencies that are wrestling with these issues and put them on the stage and describe how they're doing it. So there's not, I think then again, you're getting into the diversity issues. Do you have people from a diverse set of backgrounds actually doing the data collection and managing and sort of doing that analysis? These are the kinds of steps that we start to need to put in place and be aware of in order to mitigate that kind of bias. But again, I put that back to the others as well.
Anybody else want to jump in? Ted or Dimitri? Ted?
I'll just say a couple things on this. I mean, I think the reason that we're getting these questions now is because there's a broader awareness of some of the bias in the data, and how, as we've developed AI models equally in the private sector as in the public sector, that there are some things we need to take in consideration with the data. And I think we're just at the beginning of learning that, and it takes people noticing those things for us to learn, right? So again, I think some best practices are emerging in terms of how to have the right representation in the data to be able to produce models that don't have bias. But this is going to be an ongoing, long-term project, and I just expect that we'll continue to learn a lot. And so I'm glad it's part of the conversation.
And I think as you, I mean, I put this out there to all of you, and maybe this, Dimitri, I didn't fully answer your question way back in terms of how we can come together. Certainly we're looking for those use cases. And then just on the bias issue, I think we have to be willing to at least experiment and try and recognize that we are going to fail, but the whole point is we're going to learn from what we do. And so maybe trying things that are a little bit lower risk rather than higher risk areas and projects or initiatives is probably a good place to start to get people used to what you're going to come across, what are some of the pitfalls. But then, a way that we could come together is to active. If you've tried something, I'd love to put you, Ted, Gil, Dimitri on the stage and share, here's an actual use case. Here are the issues we came across with respect to bias or getting data stewards on board. I mean, the whole range of issues, but that is a mechanism that we aim to serve. So I'd be remiss if I didn't at least plug that before we're done with our panel.
I think those are all good answers too. So I don't have too much more to add other than I think some of these issues will be subtle. As we aggregate more data, as we start pooling more together, privacy issues will surface in probably surprising way, and ethical issues and bias in ways that we had not thought. And so, you start with some initial data and you think you have a good sense of these things, but now you augment it with other kinds of information to try and solve the problems you're doing. And then you realize, oh, you know, if we look at it this way, we could pull out this kind of information. And I think this will happen as a natural course. And so how do we build in kind of the social science aspect of this understanding and into the processes that we're developing, which are more technology based, is going to be some new territory. We have traditionally not done that. And I think we're going to have to think about this as part of the team that we built to answer questions.
All right, excellent. Here's a two-part question from Michael. We're going to start with part one, and then maybe we'll get to part two. Part one says, if you were to break the AI ML process into multiple phases, business case development, data preparation, data processing, data presentation, which of those steps creates the biggest challenge? That's for anyone, of course.
You know, I would say, you know, data from my point of view is like 90% of the work. Once you've distilled it to learning from it, I think we know what to do. The data side is really tricky for so many reasons. And I think depending on the privacy content or security content of the information, you know, there will be a different balance of the data challenges that you face. And so I think the answer is it depends, but I think the burden, the largest burden on any of this is on the data. How you get it, what you do with it, how you structure and label it and prepare it, manage it, govern access, record it, you know, all of this is really non-trivial.
Yeah, this is Gil. Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly with Dimitri. I think it's really all about the data, especially when you think about AI, making AI-able data, making the data suitable for AI from the beginning. Is a challenge. A lot of the data we have now wasn't originally designed for AI. How do you make it designed and ready for use in AI is a challenge, and one that, you know, has a number of different potential avenues that are being explored.
I mean, I was just going to say, just to jump in, certainly the data, that's a very heavy lift. Like that's a labor intensive task that takes quite a bit of time. I think that's what you're getting at. I think you've also alluded to this earlier, I forget who mentioned it, but just trying to figure out which problems that we should be solving and what data is actually required is another challenge that I think we're all facing. I think we're seeing that a bit. That may be less of a labor intensive task, so to speak, but it also speaks to some of the organizational and or cultural mindsets of like being comfortable with even approaching AI and using it in this way. That is its own challenge, the organizational piece, but it's maybe not quite as labor intensive as the data side. I don't know if you all would agree with that or not.
All right, let's move on. We have about 10 minutes left, and a bunch of questions still in the queue, but continue to please send them in to our audience. Merrick asks, and this is specifically for Dimitri, how do you manage / orchestrate the various AI and ML tools and processes used to drive outcomes, and how do you take action on the data? So even though that's for Dimitri, it's probably a good question for everyone, but Dimitri, if you could kick us off, how do you manage or orchestrate the various AI, ML tools and processes to drive outcomes?
I think at the moment, our starting point has been kind of capturing the organic work that is already happening. So there are a couple of ways to look at this. We have started a few focused AI efforts where we've created workflows and we've looked at, you know, defined problems we're trying to solve and then created everything behind it, the data, the modeling, the simulation, kind of the business model for those. But I would say, aside from a few pilot efforts like that, most of this is organically developed as people have started to focus more on how to best use the data they have across the enterprise, across our labs, across all the different programs and missions. Everyone is approaching it in their own way, you know, and the task we have right now is to try and answer that question. How do we make best use of the tools being developed? Part of that is in feeling the pulse of what people are doing is identifying the gaps. What is it that is commercially available that can be simply pushed to people's problems to solve? What are problems that we don't see the private sector developing and we're going to have to develop because there is no other way? And so understanding the gaps is part of this in trying to manage where we push investments to develop AI and ML tools. So without understanding the challenges people are facing and what our state of the art is, it's hard to have an understanding of what to develop next because we don't want to reproduce things that have already been done somewhere. So it's a bit of a mix right now. We have a sense of what we can do, but we certainly see there are things that we don't know how to do yet. And the next steps will be to try and bring a top-down structure into some of these harder tools that will need to be developed for this purpose.
Okay, so I guess the question, and we're almost out of time, but so let me open it to someone else. I think this person was really more asking about tools than the data side. So as agencies are either buying tools or developing tools, how do you manage, orchestrate the tools? I don't know if Ted or Gil want to jump in on this.
Sure. As I mentioned, we have stood up an enterprise analytics platform for the first time that increasingly more people are using. That being said, there is quite an array of tools, as you might imagine, that are being used across the department. We've made some efforts to standardize. So we've standardized on a data visualization tool. We want to do more of that because we think that there's value in that. And so we're gathering requirements by working with all of our analytics teams across the department to better understand what tools they need that they don't have access to, and how we can more efficiently and effectively procure them as a department where that makes sense. And so this is something we're really focused on now. And it still remains to be, I think, done at an enterprise level for sure. But there is a lot of opportunity for people who are using tools on desktops where cloud-based tools give them better performance, better tools, better access to the data that they need. Given that we've done a lot of work with integrating, we want to be able to capitalize on that. So this year we're going to be doing a lot of that.
All right, we have about time for one more question, but if there's anybody else want to jump in on that tools question. All right, so I was saving this question for last because I think this is a great question from Donna. And she asks, as quote unquote data guys, and I can do this now because we're on video, do you have a favorite blogger, analyst, scientist that you're following around with data-centric aspects of COVID-19? I'll expand it even more broader than just COVID-19, but if you have a recommendation, who do you follow? Who do you whether it's an author, scientist, analyst, anyone that you want to share?
I would only add, I ingest whatever I can. So good ideas are just about everywhere. There is no, single point for all of that. And I think you'll find them almost anywhere. And so I'm open to whoever has good ideas at any time.
Very politically, thank you, Dr. Dimitri. I like everybody equally, all my children. Steve?
Yeah, that's my diplomatic answer as well. No, I agree, but I'm very much in the mode of following all of you to figure out what exactly you're doing and how do we raise that up. I think that, to be honest, there's a lot of people doing some interesting work. So how do we sort of pull that together? I'm very focused on that.
But who is that person doing interesting work? See?
Oh, well, I'm looking at Dimitri. I'm looking at the panelists right now, to be quite honest. We need to get them on the stage. I am quite serious about that. The more that we can share the kinds of work you're doing, I'm sure there's like numerous use cases that you've got underway. To the extent that you can put some of those out in the ecosystem, I think that's going to prove beneficial across. So diplomatic,
right. And I know of about a dozen or so reporters who would love to talk to all of you about some really great good news use cases using AI and ML. So don't forget about us people in the media. Gil, anybody you follow?
Well, I think, like data, it's important, right? If you look at data and only have one source, that can lead to, biased results, right? So I would say that, it's really important to look at across. And so basically, like others, I basically don't necessarily follow one or two people, but rather, as stories come in, then I'll look at multiple different sources and then try to see where there's agreement, where there's disagreement, and then, make decisions, on next course based on that.
All right, Ted, do you want to take the last word, or do you want to be diplomatic like everybody else and say, I'm just looking for really smart and interesting things? All right, well, in that case, let me first thank our panelists for taking the time today. You guys did a great job, especially for at least for me, the first virtual event with AFCEA Bethesda, so thank you for that. I'm gonna pass it back over to Nana, who's gonna talk to us a little bit and say thank you and goodbye. So thank you all very much. We could give everyone a round of applause internally to ourselves.
Thank you, Jason, and that truly was a great panel. And I wanted to thank, I think Dr. Kusnezov dropped off and Ted dropped off, but in terms of the attendees, please continue to check our chapter and event website for our updates. And I wanted to add that our thoughts are with all of those affected by the situation. We look forward to seeing all of you again, either virtually or in person, at our next event. And if you have any comments about this webinar, please feel free to send us any suggestions or just your thoughts on it. And Jason, that was an excellent job. And until then, I obviously want to say, everyone, please stay healthy and safe, and hopefully we'll be able to do this in person next month. And thank you.
All right, thank you all too. Take
Thanks
care.
a lot. This is fun.